blizzard howled its lonely song around Elias Thorne's secluded cabin. He heard a faint cry slicing through the wind, a sound that should not be in this remote wilderness. To ignore it meant a soul would surely be lost to the unforgiving mountain. Elias pulled his heavy furs tighter, the decision to investigate stirring an unwelcome discomfort within him. He secured his snowshoes, then pushed into the swirling white fury, the cold biting through his layers. The faint cry pulled him deeper into a snowdrift-choked ravine, each step a battle against the rising drifts. There, half buried, a mother huddled over a small child. Elara Vance was barely conscious, her face pale against the snow, her lips blue. The child Lila lay still in her arms. Elias felt a cold dread, a familiar ache of helplessness he had long sought to outrun. Elara's eyes fluttered open, locking onto his, wide with desperate pleading. Her voice was a raw whisper, asking for help, for her child. He recognized the stark terror in her gaze, a mirror of something he once knew. The mountain man knew he could not simply turn away, not from this. A choice made, Elias moved with practiced urgency. He gently scooped Elara Vance from her mother's arms, the child alarmingly light and cold. He supported Elara, urging her to put one foot in front of the other, her body heavy and unresponsive. The blizzard, as if sensing their struggle, intensified its assault, throwing blinding snow and freezing gusts against them. Elias strained, his muscles burning, fighting for every inch of ground. The path back to his cabin, usually familiar, became a treacherous maze. He focused only on the flicker of warmth in his mind, the small sanctuary that awaited them. Each breath was a puff of frozen vapor, each step a testament to sheer will against the overwhelming might of the winter storm. Finally, the dark shape of the cabin emerged from the maelstrom, a beacon of hope against the endless white. Elias Thorne kicked the door shut against the raging wind, carrying Lila inside and gently laying her on his furs by the roaring fire. He helped Elara to a stool, then quickly stripped away their frozen outer layers, wrapping them in dry blankets. He moved with a quiet efficiency, stoking the fire until it roared, then preparing a hot, weak broth. The steam rose, carrying the scent of warmth and nourishment into the cold air. Lila stirred, a small cough escaping her lips. Elara's eyes, now more alert, met Elias's. She offered a whispered thank you, her voice hoarse with cold and gratitude. Elias watched them, a profound relief washing over him, followed by a familiar, unsettling wave of discomfort at this sudden, unexpected company in his solitary world. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the small window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Elara Vance, still weak but recovering, rose from the furs and tried to organize the cabin, straightening a stack of kindling, brushing dirt from the floor. Elias Thorne observed her from his usual perch by the fire, a quiet unease stirring within him. He had lived alone for years, and her efforts, though well-intentioned, felt like an intrusion on his carefully ordered solitude. Elara Vance, now awake and full of a child's boundless curiosity, began to explore the small space, her small fingers tracing the rough-hewn walls. Elara offered a polite question about his trapping roots, and Elias gave a terse but polite reply. He felt the collision of their two very different worlds, the silence of his existence now punctuated by unfamiliar sounds and movements. Lila's exploration led her to a narrow shelf above Elias Thorne's bunk. Her small hand reached out, and she pulled down a small, intricately carved wooden bird. Its wings spread as if in flight. "Mama," she asked, her voice clear, "who made this pretty bird?" Elias felt a sudden sharp pang in his chest, his gaze snapping to the object in Lila's hand. He moved quickly, his large hand gently taking the bird from her, his expression clouding with an old pain Elara Vance noticed instantly. He mumbled that he had made it long ago, offering no further explanation. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he placed the bird back on the shelf, not quite meeting Elara's watchful gaze. His careful solitude had always been a shield, a wall built against the ghosts of his past losses. Lila's innocent question had found a crack in that wall. That evening, the cabin felt warmer, the blizzard's memory fading in the firelight. Elias Thorne sat across from Elara Vance, the small carved bird heavy in his pocket. Elara Vance slept soundly on a makeshift bed of furs. Elara looked into the dancing flames, her voice soft but steady, a story unfolding slowly in the quiet space. She spoke of their wagon train, a hopeful journey west that turned into a struggle against the elements. A sudden fever took her husband, leaving her alone with Lila, far from any settlement. Then came the flash flood, separating them from the others, carrying away their remaining supplies. She had walked for days, a desperate attempt to reach the nearest trading post, relying on old trail maps and pure will. Elias listened without interruption. His eyes, usually guarded, held a flicker of understanding. He saw the grim resolve in her tired face, a spirit forged by hardship that mirrored something in himself. He imagined the vast, unforgiving miles she had covered, a mother protecting her child against an indifferent world. Her words painted a picture of raw courage, a strength that had brought them to his secluded valley. He acknowledged her struggle, recognizing the deep cost of her journey, and a quiet respect began to settle between them. The next morning, the cabin air held a crispness, but the sun promised a thaw. Elias Thorne moved with practiced ease, preparing his trapping gear. He knew their arrangement could not be charity, for her pride and for his own. He spoke plainly to Elara Vance, suggesting a trade that honored both their needs. Elias offered shelter, the warmth of the cabin, and the food he hunted. In return, he proposed that Elara could cook for them both and mend their worn clothes. Elara met his gaze, her expression thoughtful. She affirmed that she would not take charity, but she would work, her voice firm. Elias saw the integrity in her eyes, a reflection of the hard-won dignity he understood. He offered his hand. Their grip was firm, a business-like pact forged between two survivors. Yet beneath the surface, a deeper, unspoken need for companionship began to stir. Elias felt the fragile beginning of a shared burden, a responsibility he had not sought but now accepted. Over the next few days, a new rhythm settled into the isolated valley. Elara Vance moved quietly within the cabin, her presence bringing a subtle order that Elias Thorne had never known. She cleaned the dusty corners, organized the meager supplies, and soon the small space felt less like a trapper's den and more like a home. Elias noticed the faint smell of wood smoke and a lingering scent of pine filling the air, a welcome change. Lila Vance, now recovered from the cold, became a constant, curious shadow. She followed Elias on his short excursions around the cabin, her small voice peppering him with endless questions about the trees, the animals, and the way the wind whispered through the pines. Elias, accustomed to the deep silence of the wilderness, found himself answering each question with a patience that surprised him. He pointed out squirrel nests, identified bird calls, and showed her how to recognize deer tracks in the softening earth. Elias Thorne found a quiet enjoyment in her innocent wonder, a small light breaking through his years of solitude. The peaceful rhythm was soon tested when an unseasonable spring snowstorm swept down from the high peaks. The sky turned a sudden, heavy gray, and large flakes began to fall, threatening to bury their newly found sense of security. Elias Thorne moved with swift efficiency. He began securing the cabin, checking the roof and windows for leaks. Elara Vance joined him without a word, her movements quick and purposeful. She helped gather extra firewood, her hands working in unison with his as they stacked logs near the door. Lila Vance, bundled in a heavy blanket, tried to help in her small ways, carrying twigs and feeling a part of their shared effort. The cabin became a beacon of warmth against the intensifying blizzard. They moved with an unspoken understanding, their combined strength a bulwark against the sudden return of winter's fury. Anyone listening in the dark notices a warmer space and keeps it close. Elias felt a quiet pride in their teamwork, a sense that they faced this challenge as one, their bond deepening with every shared burden. Inside the cabin, as the snowstorm raged outside, a quiet intimacy settled around the fire. The flickering flames cast long shadows that danced on the walls, seeming to coax secrets from the deep. Elias Thorne found himself staring into the heart of the fire, the warmth a sharp contrast to the cold that had long resided within him. He spoke haltingly, his voice rough with disuse, of a time years ago when he had a wife, a young son. He told Elara Vance how he had been away trapping, chasing a better season, foolishly thinking he could provide more for them. He returned to an empty house to news of a swift illness, a fever that had taken them both. Elias admitted his guilt, a raw wound that had never truly healed. confessing how their loss had driven him deep into the wilderness, seeking solitude as a penance. Elara listened, her eyes fixed on his shadowed face, offering no words of pity, only a deep, silent understanding. She saw the pain in his gaze, a grief that had sculpted him into the solitary man he was, and in that shared vulnerability, a profound shift occurred between them. Elias had hidden this wound for years, allowing it to define his solitary life. Now with Elara's quiet presence, the truth felt less like a burden and more like a path toward a different future. The harsh grip of winter slowly loosened its hold on the mountain pass, a faint warmth in the air signaling the arrival of spring. Inside Elias Thorne's cabin, the stark solitude that once defined his days had softened, replaced by a quiet, rhythmic hum of shared life. Sunlight, no longer a fleeting visitor, streamed through the small, greased paper window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and highlighting the subtle changes Elara Vance had brought to the rough dwelling. Elias watched her as she sat by the fire, her nimble fingers working with practiced grace. Elara mended his worn buckskin jacket, the hide softened from years of use and countless repairs. She had found a small piece of sinew and thread in his sparse supplies, and now her needle moved with quiet purpose. Unconsciously, her stitches began to form a small, intricate pattern on the leather, a delicate flourish Elias had never seen on his practical garments. It was a detail only a woman's touch could add, a small, beautiful mark of care that spoke volumes without a single word. Elias felt a strange warmth spread through him, a feeling both foreign and welcome. Across the cabin, Lila Vance sat on the floor, her small hands fumbling with a piece of pine. Elias had taken to carving small figures from wood, a skill he had honed over long, lonely winters. Now he found himself shaping a miniature stool for Lila, carefully smoothing the edges. He guided her tiny fingers, showing her how to hold the whittling knife, demonstrating the gentle pressure needed to peel away thin curls of wood. Lila's face was a picture of intense concentration, punctuated by bursts of soft laughter as a wood shaving curled just right. Her laughter, a bright, clear sound, filled the cabin, echoing off the log walls in a way Elias had not heard in years, perhaps not since he himself was a child. It was a sound that chased away the lingering shadows of his grief, a melody that brought light into the corners of his once silent world. Elias found himself smiling, a slow, unpracticed movement that felt unfamiliar on his weathered face, yet completely natural. The cabin, once a fortress against the world, was slowly, irrevocably transforming into a home, woven together by these small, unspoken intimacies. Elias watched them, a profound sense of peace settling over him, a feeling he had once believed lost forever. He knew his quiet ways were slowly fading. The next morning, Elias Thorne left the cabin before dawn, the air still crisp with the promise of a warming day. But the ground beneath his boots was no longer frozen solid. He tended his trap lines, a routine etched into his very being, yet something felt different now. The vast, silent wilderness that had once been his sole companion now seemed emptier, a quiet echo of a loneliness he no longer fully inhabited. As he checked a snare, his thoughts drifted back to Elara Vance and Lila Vance in the cabin. He found himself thinking of his lost family, his wife and young son, the ache of their absence, a familiar, dull throb in his chest. The memory of their faces, once a source of crushing sorrow, now mingled with the images of Elara's determined eyes and Lila's innocent laughter. The comparison was sharp, almost painful. This new fragile life he was building, this unexpected warmth, made his old wound more acute, yet also less consuming. It was as if the new light was finally reaching into the darkest corners of his grief. Elias reached into his pocket and touched the small, intricately carved wooden bird, its smooth surface worn from countless touches. It was a silent reminder of his loss, a tangible piece of the past that had clung to him through years of self-imposed exile. But now it also felt like a promise, a symbol of newfound hope. He remembered Lila's curious fingers on it, her innocent questions that had pricked at his guarded heart. A brief moment of fear washed over him, a cold dread that he might fail again, that this fragile happiness could be snatched away just as swiftly as his old life had been. He pushed the thought away, clenching his jaw. He would not fail them. Later that day, Elias Thorne ventured deeper into a remote part of his trapping territory, the scent of pine and damp earth heavy in the air. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who knew every rustle of leaf, every snap of twig. But as he approached one of his furthest traps, a different kind of disturbance caught his keen eye. Unusually fresh, heavy boot tracks marred the soft ground near the trap, prints too large and too deliberate to belong to any animal. They were not his own, nor those of any known trapper in these parts. A prickle of unease ran down Elias's spine, a primal warning. He followed the tracks a short distance, his senses heightened. The ground was disturbed in a way that suggested human interference, not a natural passage. When he reached the trap, his fears were confirmed. The snare was sprung not by the frantic struggle of a caught animal, but by human hands. The wood was splintered, clearly broken with intention, a malicious act rather than an accidental tripping. This was no mistake. A profound sense of intrusion settled over Elias Thorne. His peaceful isolation, the hard-won quiet of his mountain life, had been breached. This was a deliberate act, a warning of human presence where none should be. The wilderness had always held its own dangers, but they were familiar, predictable in their wildness. These tracks, this damaged trap, spoke of something far more sinister. Elias's jaw tightened. He stood for a long moment, listening to the silence of the forest, which now felt less peaceful and more watchful. Anyone listening in the dark notices a warmer space and keeps it close. The quiet forest felt suddenly less of a refuge and more of a vulnerable point, a truth that landed with a cold weight in Elias's gut. The path back to the cabin felt longer, the air heavier with the unspoken threat of what those tracks represented. That evening, the cabin felt smaller, the warmth of the fire struggling to dispel the chill that had settled in Elias Thorne's spirit. Elara Vance, ever perceptive, noticed the change in him immediately. Elias was unusually quiet during dinner, his gaze distant, his movements sharper than usual. His awareness seemed heightened, his ears cocked toward the sounds of the night beyond the cabin walls, a silent vigilance that was a stark contrast to his earlier contentment. Elara watched him from across the rough-hewn table, her own eyes filled with a quiet concern. Lila Vance, oblivious to the unspoken tension, chattered happily about a squirrel she had seen that day. Elias offered only gruff, one-word answers, occasionally stroking Lila's hair absent-mindedly. Finally, Elara broke the strained silence. She asked if anything was wrong, her voice soft, but direct. Elias dismissed her question curtly, saying only that his traps had been light, a common occurrence. He avoided her gaze, focusing instead on the flickering fire. Despite his denial, Elara sensed the shift within him, the re-emergence of the guarded, wary man she had first encountered in the snow. She knew his silences, knew that sometimes they spoke louder than any words. Elara continued to watch him, her brow furrowed with worry, a silent understanding passing between them that neither dared to voice. The warmth of the cabin, once a comfort, now felt like a fragile shield against an unseen threat. Inside the cabin, as dusk deepened and the fire cast long, dancing shadows, Elias Thorne sat on a small stool, a piece of soft pine in his large calloused hands. He had been quiet for most of the evening, the unease from his day in the trapping grounds still clinging to him. But now, as Lila Vance prepared for bedtime, her small body curled by the hearth, Elias began to carve. His knife moved with familiar precision, shaping the wood into a new, small animal figure. A bear cub this time, stout and strong. He offered it to Lila, holding out the freshly carved wood. Her eyes widened, bright with unreserved joy, as she took the little bear. She clutched it to her chest, her smile beaming. Her words, soft and innocent, pierced through Elias's lingering worries and settled deep within his hardened heart. Lila looked up at him, her eyes full of pure trust, and called him Papa Elias. The new name startled Elias Thorne, echoing in the quiet cabin, a profound sound that shook something loose inside him. He had not been called Papa in years, not since his own son had died, and the title had been a source of unbearable pain. But now, spoken by Lila, it carried no such burden. Instead, a quiet, unexpected warmth spread through him, a feeling both tender and overwhelming. It was a stark contrast to the deep, aching emptiness he had carried for so long, a clear sign of the profound internal shift that had taken root within him. Elias, the solitary mountain man, was no longer truly alone. He had found a new reason to stay, a new family to protect, and the meaning of his own life had irrevocably changed. The crisp morning air usually brought Elias Thorne a quiet comfort, a familiar peace after days of tending his traps. On this particular spring morning, however, a discordant rumble broke the stillness of the high pass. Elias stood by the cabin door, watching Elara and Lila gather wildflowers by the creek, a small, precious routine they had found. He heard the distant thud of hooves on packed earth, a sound out of place in his secluded valley, growing steadily louder. 3 figures on horseback emerged from the pine line, stark against the brilliant blue sky. The lead rider, a large man with a heavy coat and a cruel set to his mouth, surveyed the small clearing, his gaze lingering on the cabin with an unwelcome possessiveness. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his gut, recognizing the predatory intent in the stranger's posture. He stepped forward, his body instinctively moving to place himself between the approaching men and the unsuspecting Elara and Lila. The horses drew closer, their breath pluming in the still air. The 2 men behind the leader were burly, their faces hard and unyielding. The lead rider dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace, his eyes never leaving Elias. He was a man accustomed to being obeyed. His boots crunched on the gravel as he approached, a faint, unsettling smile playing on his lips. Elias knew this type of man. He had seen them in other towns, their ambition carving paths of destruction. Elara, alerted by the sudden quiet of the birds, looked up, her hand instantly finding Lila's. Lila, with her small basket of bluebells, paused her singing, her innocent gaze fixed on the newcomers. Elias's hand hovered near the heavy knife at his belt, a silent promise of defense. The air crackled with unspoken challenge. The large man stopped a few paces from Elias, his gaze flicking to Elara and Lila, then back to Elias with an appraising, dismissive look. He spoke, his voice a low growl that held a false politeness, like a wolf offering a handshake. He said his name was Silas Kincaid. He said he understood Elias had made himself comfortable on this land. Elias's voice was flat, a warning in its brevity. He asked Silas what business he had there. Silas chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound, and said he had the business of ownership. Elias felt the familiar prickle of old anger, a sensation he had worked hard to bury. He met Silas's gaze, his own eyes as hard and unyielding as the mountain stone. Silas Kincaid took another slow step forward, his eyes scanning the cabin, the creek, the entire valley as if he already owned it. He spoke of having a legal claim to this valley, a paper signed and sealed in a distant county office. He spoke of an old land grant, vague and conveniently forgotten by most, that now, through his efforts, had been brought to light. He mentioned Elias's cabin, his traps, Elara and Lila, as if they were mere inconveniences marring his new acquisition. He said Elias was nothing more than a squatter, a trespasser on property that now rightfully belonged to Silas Kincaid. Elias felt his jaw tighten, a familiar heat rising in his chest. He had lived on this land for years, built his life here, but Silas dismissed it all with a wave of his hand. Silas gave Elias 1 week to vacate the premises, to pack up his belongings and take his woman and child with him. He said the land was too valuable now, the mountain pass too strategic, for it to remain in the hands of a mere trapper. He spoke of development, of new roads and mines, of progress that would sweep away anyone foolish enough to stand in its way. Elara stood a little behind Elias, her face pale, her grip on Lila's hand trembling slightly. Elias glanced back at them, seeing the fear in Elara's eyes, the quiet confusion in Lila's. That look solidified his resolve. This was not just about his home. It was about their safety, their future. He could not allow Silas to simply take it all. Elias's voice was low, laced with a dangerous edge. He told Silas Kincaid that this land was his, that he had lived and worked it for years, and that no paper from a distant office changed that fact. Silas merely smiled, a predatory flash of teeth. He said the law did not care about sentiment or time spent, only about deeds and titles. He said Elias had no proper claim. Elias felt a surge of indignation, the kind that made his hands clench into fists. He had always respected the wilderness laws, the unwritten rules of the mountains, but this was a different kind of law, a man-made one, wielded like a weapon. He knew in that moment that Silas Kincaid would stop at nothing. Anyone listening in the dark notices a warmer space and keeps it close. Silas simply laughed at Elias's words, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed off the surrounding pines. He said Elias would learn that money and influence spoke louder than any trapper's pride. As Silas Kincaid prepared to leave, a show of force was not far behind. One of Silas's burly men, a man with a thick neck and dull eyes, stepped away from his horse. He walked deliberately towards a small sapling Elias had carefully planted last autumn, a young pine that was just beginning to unfurl its new green needles. With a casual, brutal swing of his boot, the man kicked the sapling, snapping its delicate trunk with a sickening crack. The small tree, a symbol of new growth in Elias's quiet hopes, crumpled to the earth, its life extinguished in a single careless act. Elias took a step forward, his muscles coiling, a raw, primal fury blazing in his eyes. His hand instinctively reached for the hilt of his knife, ready to defend what was theirs, to strike back at the wanton destruction. But then he saw Elara, her face etched with terror, pulling Lila closer, shielding her eyes from the scene. Lila's small whimper pierced through Elias's rage, a cold splash of water on his burning anger. He remembered his promise, his new responsibility. He remembered the innocent trust in Lila's eyes when she called him Papa Elias. He stopped, his body trembling with the effort to control the old violence that stirred within him. His fists clenched and unclenched, his knuckles white. Silas Kincaid watched Elias's struggle, a slow, satisfied smirk spreading across his face. He nodded to his man, a silent acknowledgement of the message delivered. The sapling lay broken, a grim testament to Kincaid's power and his willingness to use it. Silas swung himself back onto his horse, his gaze lingering on the fallen sapling, then on Elias. He told Elias he had until the end of the week. He said he would send men to collect the land if Elias was not gone. His words were a clear, unmistakable threat, one that left no room for negotiation or mercy. Then, with a curt nod to his men, Silas Kincaid turned his horse and rode away, disappearing back into the pine forest as quickly as he had appeared. The clearing felt unnaturally silent, the only sound the gentle rustle of the wind and Lila's soft, frightened sobs. Elias stood there, his shoulders shaking slightly, the weight of the threat pressing down on him. The antagonists left, leaving Elias and Elara to face the new, stark reality. Inside the cabin, the quiet warmth that had settled over them felt suddenly fragile, tainted by the heavy boot prints left outside. Elias Thorne paced the small space, his long strides restless, his mind a whirlwind of old instincts and new obligations. Every nerve ending screamed for him to ride after Silas Kincaid, to confront the man in the wild, away from prying eyes, and settle this the old way. He imagined the clash, the raw satisfaction of fighting for what was his, of tearing down the arrogance he had just witnessed. His hand still trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the suppressed violence that churned within him. This was the man he had been, the man he had left behind in the solitude of the mountains. Elara sat huddled on the small bed, clutching Lila to her chest. Lila, exhausted by the sudden fear, had cried herself into a fitful sleep, her small body shaking with residual fright. Elara looked up at Elias, her eyes wide with a desperate fear he had rarely seen in her. She spoke of being forced back into the wilderness, of facing the harsh unknown again, perhaps even worse. She asked Elias what they would do, where they would go if Silas truly managed to take their home. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through Elias's anger, reaching the core of his new resolve. He saw the vulnerability she had tried so hard to hide, the raw terror of a mother trying to protect her child against a world that had already taken so much. Elias stopped his pacing, his gaze falling on Lila's innocent, tear-streaked face. Her small, sleeping form was a potent reminder of everything he now had to lose. This was not just about his solitude, his independence, his right to this land. This was about their home, their safety, the fragile hope that had begun to bloom within him. He remembered Lila calling him Papa Elias, a name that had startled him but had also filled him with an unexpected warmth. He knew he could not allow that light to be extinguished by Kincaid's greed. He looked at Elara, offering a gruff assurance that they would not be leaving, that he would not let it happen. His words were meant to calm her, but inside, Elias felt a cold dread mixed with his fury. He understood this fight was bigger than just him. Later that night, long after Lila had truly fallen asleep, Elias Thorne sat across from Elara by the dying fire, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on their faces. The cabin creaked around them, a familiar sound that now seemed to whisper of encroaching danger. Elias knew he could not fight Silas Kincaid with brute force alone, not anymore. He had Elara and Lila to consider, and violence would only put them at greater risk. He had to think, to plan, to use a different kind of strength. He explained to Elara that he needed to go to the trading post, the nearest settlement, to investigate Silas Kincaid's claims. He had to verify the validity of any deed Kincaid might hold, to seek advice from anyone who might know the local land laws. Elara listened, her face a mask of worry, but she nodded slowly, understanding the necessity of his journey. She expressed her fear of being left alone with Lila, but her voice held a quiet resolve, not a plea for him to stay. She knew this was their only chance. They discussed a plan for their safety during his absence. Elias would secure the cabin as best he could, reinforce the doors and windows. He would leave her his old rifle and teach her how to use it, a grim necessity he wished he did not have to impart. He promised to return as quickly as possible, to ride day and night if he had to, his words a solemn vow. Elara made him promise to be careful, to avoid any unnecessary risks. Elias began to pack his saddlebag, gathering only the essentials for a swift journey. He spread a worn map on the rough-hewn table, tracing the route to the trading post with a calloused finger. The journey would be long and arduous, through unfamiliar territory for Elara, but a path Elias knew well. He would need to be quick, to return before Kincaid's week was up, before the threat turned into action. Elara watched him, her heart heavy, but a flicker of hope began to stir within her. This path meant leaving the safety of their newfound home, but it also meant fighting for it, facing the outside world head-on. Elias knew this was a risk, perhaps the biggest he had taken in years, but for Elara and Lila, it was a necessary one. This is a moment when a careful heart chooses patience over fear. Elias realized Silas Kincaid was not just after the land, but the entire valley, a much larger scheme than Elias had first imagined. He also understood that his own solitary ways had left him vulnerable, and that this fight for his home would require him to finally trust in something beyond himself. Elias Thorne stood beside his sturdy horse in the dim pre-dawn light, the cabin door a rectangle of faint warmth behind him. He looked at Elara Vance, her face pale in the gloom, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resolute strength. The unspoken weight of their new responsibility settled between them, a heavy cloak against the crisp morning air. Elias had to leave them, but the valley, their fragile home, felt more vulnerable now than ever before. He knew the journey was long and dangerous, but staying meant surrendering their future to Silas Kincaid. Lila Vance, a small bundle of sleepiness, padded out from the cabin and wrapped her arms around Elias's leg, her tiny voice muffled against his buckskin trousers. She called him Papa Elias, a name that still surprised him with its warmth, a name that felt earned and precious. Elias knelt, pulling her close, a brief, fierce hug that conveyed all his promises. He told her he would return soon and that she must be a good helper for Elara. Lila nodded, her eyes trusting, clutching her small carved squirrel. Elias then stood, meeting Elara's gaze once more. He told her to bar the door and keep the rifle close, trusting her competence. Elara simply nodded, her hand going to her own pocket, where Elias knew she kept a small, smooth stone, a simple comfort in uncertain times. The rising sun painted the distant peaks in hues of gold and rose as Elias mounted his horse. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a scent of spring pushing against the last vestiges of winter's chill. He took one last look at the cabin, a small, solitary beacon of hope against the vast wilderness, before turning his horse towards the winding trail. Elara and Lila stood framed in the doorway, two small figures against the growing light, embodying every reason Elias now rode away. He carried their hope, a heavy but potent burden, into the unknown. The quiet departure marked a new kind of journey for Elias, one not just for survival, but for a future he was beginning to believe in. Elias Thorne rode steadily, his horse picking its way through the thawing mountain trails. The high pass loomed, a formidable guardian of the valley, its slopes still clutched by lingering snowdrifts and sheets of ice. He navigated treacherous stretches, his years of living in the wilderness making each decision, each shift of weight, almost instinctive. Below him, swift rivers, swollen with snowmelt, roared through narrow canyons, their icy waters a constant reminder of nature's indifferent power. He relied on his deep knowledge of these mountains, reading the subtle signs of the wind, the shifting patterns of the snow, the faint tracks of deer and elk. With each mile, thoughts of Elara and Lila pressed in, a constant undercurrent beneath the demands of the journey. He remembered Lila's small hand in his, Elara's quiet strength, and the warmth they had brought to his solitary cabin. These thoughts, once a source of only pain when he remembered his lost family, now served to steel his resolve. He would not fail them. Elias pushed through a particularly dense thicket of spruce, the branches clawing at his coat, when he noticed something out of place. A small, carefully constructed cairn, a stack of flat stones, stood on a rise, clearly human-made and distinct from any trail marker a trapper would use. It was not on any of his maps, nor did it point to any known path. Curiosity, a trait often suppressed by caution, urged Elias to investigate. He dismounted, leading his horse, and followed the direction the cairn seemed to indicate, pushing through thick underbrush for a short distance. There, tucked beneath an overhang, he found the remnants of a temporary camp, recently abandoned. A few discarded tins, a snuffed fire pit, and boot prints much larger than any trapper he knew. These were not the signs of casual travelers or even his fellow mountain men. These were Kincaid's men, he realized, scouting far deeper into the wilderness than Elias had ever imagined. They were looking for something specific, not merely passing through. This valley, his home, was part of a larger, more insidious plan. The discovery deepened Elias's understanding of Kincaid's reach and the pervasive nature of the threat. This meant his fight was not just against a greedy man, but against a network of influence, and he knew he must move with even greater cunning. After several more arduous days, Elias Thorne finally reached the trading post, a small cluster of dusty buildings clinging to the edge of the wilderness. The cacophony of voices, the smell of stale whiskey and unwashed bodies, and the sheer press of humanity felt jarring after his weeks of solitude. He dismounted, feeling the unfamiliar scrutiny of the townsfolk, their eyes lingering on his weathered buckskin and the rifle he carried with an easy, practiced grace. Elias felt like a wild thing trapped in a cage, an outsider in this bustling, dusty world. He made his way to the saloon, the most likely place to gather information. The room was thick with tobacco smoke and the low murmur of conversations. Elias approached the long wooden bar, his gaze sweeping the room, assessing the faces, searching for any hint of Kincaid's men. Bartender Jed, a burly man with a perpetually tired expression and hands scarred from years of hard work, wiped down the counter with a damp rag. Elias ordered a coffee, his voice rough from disuse, and waited. He then asked casually if Jed had seen Silas Kincaid around lately. Jed paused, his rag still, and gave Elias a long, wary look, his eyes assessing. He said Kincaid had been in and out, always with his rough-hired men, causing trouble as usual, buying up whatever he could get his hands on. Jed mentioned Kincaid had been boasting about some new land claim, a big piece of the valley. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He asked Jed if he knew anything about an old prospector named Merrick, who used to work a claim further up the valley. Jed frowned, shaking his head. He remembered Merrick, a strange old recluse, but knew nothing of his land deals. He did say Kincaid had a way of making sure things went his way, often through intimidation or by simply outspending folks who had less. Jed warned Elias that Kincaid had friends in high places and that questioning him openly could bring a man a world of trouble. Elias thanked him, leaving a few coins on the counter, his mind already turning to the next step. The trading post felt like a viper's nest, full of whispers and hidden dangers. Later that day, Elias Thorne sat alone at a rickety table in a quiet corner of the trading post, nursing a second cup of coffee. He pretended to watch the busy street outside, but his thoughts were consumed by Kincaid and the new threat the man posed. Elias knew he needed more than Jed's vague warnings. He needed proof. Just then, an old man, thin and wizened as a dried apple, shuffled toward his table. Old Man Finch, a prospector whose face was a roadmap of sun and wind, wore clothes patched so many times they seemed to be a tapestry of hardship. Finch recognized the description of the valley Elias had mentioned to Jed, and he sat down uninvited, a knowing glint in his rheumy eyes. Finch spoke in a raspy whisper, recounting tales of the valley's earliest days, of the feverish hunt for gold and silver. He told Elias that the original prospector in the valley, a man everyone called Mad Merrick, had been a peculiar sort, obsessed with mapping every inch of his claim. Finch chuckled, saying Merrick openly despised Kincaid, calling him a snake in the grass even back then. He said Merrick kept meticulous records, not just of his claims, but of every transaction, every boundary stone, every legal paper. Finch leaned closer, his voice dropping further. He said Kincaid had tried to buy Merrick out years ago, but Merrick had refused, swearing the land would never fall into Kincaid's greedy hands. Finch then looked at Elias with a clear, direct gaze. He suggested Kincaid might be lying about his claim, that Merrick would have never willingly given up that land to him. Elias felt a surge of hope, a glimmer of truth cutting through the murky waters of suspicion. He asked Finch if he knew where Merrick's cabin was, knowing the old man had been a hermit. Finch nodded, pointing vaguely towards the hills beyond the trading post. He described it as a hidden place, well off the beaten path, near a stand of ancient pines, a spot only a few old-timers would remember. Elias felt a plan taking shape in his mind. The old prospector's words, though rambling, offered a clear path forward. Elias knew what he had to do next. The next day, Elias Thorne followed Old Man Finch's directions, riding a secluded, overgrown trail that few men would have remembered. He pushed through dense thickets and scaled rocky outcrops, his experienced eyes scanning for the specific cluster of ancient pines Finch had described. Finally, tucked away in a small hollow, he found it. Merrick's long-abandoned cabin stood as a skeletal reminder of a life lived and lost, its roof sagging, its windows empty sockets, staring out at the silent wilderness. The air inside was heavy with the scent of decay and damp earth, but Elias felt a strange sense of purpose, a connection to the man who had despised Kincaid as much as he did. He began to search methodically, his hands sifting through dusty shelves and fallen planks. He found old prospecting tools, rusted pans, and faded geological charts. Beneath a loose floorboard near the stone hearth, Elias discovered a hidden strongbox, heavy and bound with iron. His heart pounded with a quiet anticipation as he forced the rusty lock. Inside, amidst a jumble of old maps and a few yellowed personal effects, lay a stack of official-looking papers. He carefully unfurled a thick parchment, his eyes scanning the elegant script. It was a legitimate deed transfer, dated years before Merrick's death. Elias read the recipient's name, and a wave of shock, then grim satisfaction, washed over him. The deed clearly stated that Merrick had transferred the land rights to a local church charity specifically for the purpose of establishing a new orphanage, not to Silas Kincaid. This was the truth, undeniable and irrefutable. Kincaid had lied, his claim a fraudulent manipulation of law and desperation. The land had been intended for the most vulnerable, a place of safety for children, a purpose far removed from Kincaid's greedy schemes. Elias now held the undeniable evidence he needed, a powerful weapon against the man who threatened his new family. He knew his path back to the valley would be swift, and his confrontation with Kincaid would be righteous. Elias Thorne rode with a new urgency, the heavy deeds secured deeply within his worn leather pack. The mountain trails, once a path of grim necessity, now felt different beneath his horse's hooves. Each turn in the winding pass brought him closer to the cabin, closer to Elara and Lila, and closer to the inevitable confrontation with Silas Kincaid. The journey, which had been physically grueling on the way out, now seemed less arduous, fueled by a powerful, unfamiliar hope. He pictured Elara's worried face, Lila's bright, trusting eyes, and a profound sense of purpose settled deep in his bones. He was no longer running from a past that haunted him. He was riding towards a future he was determined to protect. Elias knew the fight ahead would be fierce, but he also knew he would not face it alone. He held a quiet certainty that what waited for him in the valley was worth every risk. Meanwhile, in the small cabin, Elara Vance moved restlessly, her gaze constantly drawn to the single window that faced the winding trail. Elias Thorne had been gone for 3 days, and each passing hour tightened the knot of worry in her stomach. The cabin, usually a sanctuary of quiet work and Lila's gentle chatter, felt empty without his steady presence. Lila Vance, clutching her small carved animal, asked for the 10th time when Papa Elias would return. Elara would offer a brave smile, a soft word about the long journey, but inside a familiar fear gnawed at her. She remembered the cold words of Silas Kincaid, the explicit threat to their fragile home, and the vast, unforgiving wilderness that lay beyond their small clearing. She tried to busy herself with mending and cooking, but her heart was in her throat, listening for the sound of hooves. As dusk began to paint the western sky in hues of orange and purple, Elias Thorne rode into the clearing, a silhouette against the fading light. Elara stood in the cabin doorway, a quiet gasp of relief escaping her lips at the sight of him. Lila, who had been playing by the small stream, saw him too. She dropped her carved animal and ran, small legs pumping, straight into his arms. "Papa Elias," she cried, her voice ringing with pure joy. Elias dismounted, catching her up in a fierce embrace, his heart swelling. He held her close for a long moment, then looked over her head at Elara, who had approached, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Elias extended an arm, drawing her into their embrace. A profound, unwavering sense of belonging settled over him, warmer than any fire. This was more than just a cabin. This was home. Later that evening, after Lila had drifted to sleep, exhausted from her excitement, Elias Thorne and Elara Vance sat by the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across Elias's weathered face as he carefully unfolded the old deed he had found. He explained its contents to Elara, detailing how Silas Kincaid's claim was a lie, how the land truly belonged to a church charity intended for an orphanage. Elara listened intently, her expression shifting from relief to renewed determination. She traced the faded script with a finger, understanding the weight of the document. They talked long into the night, discussing how they would best present this evidence, how they would challenge Kincaid publicly and expose his deceit. Elara suggested they might reach out to others Kincaid had wronged, bringing their combined strength against his influence. The fire crackled, a warm and a steady witness to their shared purpose. The night deepened, but Elias Thorne and Elara Vance felt no tiredness. Elara expressed her unwavering support for Elias, stating simply that they were a family now, and they would fight together for their home. Elias, deeply moved by her steadfastness, admitted his greatest fear, the fear of losing them, of failing to protect them as he had failed before. He confessed his love for her and for Lila, a confession that felt both terrifying and liberating. He knew his feelings now were not born of obligation or desperation, but of a true and honest devotion. They held hands across the small table, a silent promise of enduring commitment passing between them. They chose to face the future as one, no longer two individuals surviving, but a unit bound by love. This was a choice that transcended the land claim, a decision about who they were becoming. The crisp morning air of the trading post carried the scent of pine and damp earth. Elias Thorne and Elara Vance walked purposefully through the small muddy street, the old deeds secured within Elias's buckskin jacket. They sought out Jed, the bartender with the weary eyes and the surprising wisdom, finding him sweeping the porch of his establishment. Old Man Finch sat on a bench nearby, whittling a piece of cedar, his gaze sharp beneath a tattered hat. Elias approached them, his expression firm. He pulled the document from his jacket, its yellowed parchment a stark contrast to the rough frontier around them. He explained Kincaid's deceit, detailing how Silas Kincaid had planned to steal the land, not knowing its true purpose. Elara added her voice, speaking of the orphanage Merrick had intended, a place for children without homes. Jed stopped his sweeping, his broom leaning against the wall as he listened intently. Old Man Finch paused his whittling, his eyes narrowed with understanding. Other townsfolk, drawn by the quiet but serious tone, gathered closer. Jed nodded, his face grim. He knew Kincaid's ways, the small-time swindles, the intimidation. Finch spoke of how Kincaid had once tried to cheat him out of a mining claim years ago. A few other men stepped forward, their faces etched with similar grievances against Silas Kincaid. Each shared a brief, bitter account of how Kincaid had used influence or brute force to take what was not his. They all agreed to stand with Elias and Elara. They understood that Kincaid's greed threatened everyone, not just the valley. The quiet buzz of agreement filled the small space, a growing sense of shared resolve. The group decided a public meeting was the only way to expose Kincaid's lies for all to see. Elias Thorne and Elara Vance made their way to Sheriff Brody's small office, the scent of stale tobacco hanging in the air. Sheriff Brody, a man whose shoulders carried the weight of a thankless job, looked up as they entered, his expression already tired. Elias placed the deed on Brody's desk, explaining the fraudulent claim Kincaid held and the true, charitable intent behind the document. Brody picked up the parchment, his fingers tracing the old script. He read it slowly, his brow furrowed, but his gaze remained cautious. He admitted the deed seemed legitimate, yet he hesitated. He spoke of Kincaid's power in the region, the connections he held, the trouble it would cause. Brody mentioned the lack of a formal complaint from the church charity, a technicality that left him wary of intervening too directly. Elara stepped forward, her voice clear despite the tremor of frustration. She appealed to his sense of right, reminding him of the children who would benefit from the orphanage, the true spirit of the law. She painted a picture of Kincaid's ruthless ambition crushing a promise of hope. Elias watched, his own frustration mirroring hers, but he held his tongue, letting Elara's sincerity speak for itself. Brody's gaze softened slightly as he looked at Elara, recognizing her quiet strength. He agreed to oversee a public meeting in the common hall to hear both sides. He warned them, however, that Kincaid would not yield easily. The sheriff knew the man's influence ran deeper than just land claims. As Elias Thorne and Elara Vance exited the sheriff's office, the dusty street suddenly felt colder. Silas Kincaid stood blocking their path, flanked by his two burly men, their faces like stone. Kincaid's eyes were narrow, gleaming with a dangerous light. He had heard of their visit to Brody, word traveling fast in the small settlement. Kincaid's voice was low, a menacing rumble. He warned Elias to back down, to forget this foolishness. He spoke of consequences, hinting at violence, his words dripping with venom as he threatened Elias and his newfound family. Elias felt the familiar stir of old anger, the urge to meet force with force, but he held it in check. He looked at Elara, who stood silently beside him, her back straight, her gaze steady. Her presence was a dam against his old instincts. Elias stood firm, his jaw tight, his eyes meeting Kincaid's without flinching. He would not be intimidated, not anymore. His hand did not stray to his knife, a conscious choice. Kincaid sneered, frustrated by Elias's unwavering resolve. His men shifted, their hands hovering near their own weapons. But Kincaid waved them back. He had made his point. He spun on his heel, his men following, leaving Elias and Elara standing alone in the street, the silent threat hanging heavy in the air. The watchful eyes of the townsfolk, having witnessed the encounter from their doorways and windows, added another layer of pressure. The common hall of the trading post buzzed with townsfolk the next morning. Word had spread like wildfire, tales of Kincaid's fraudulent claim and the mountain man's counter-evidence. Curiosity and concern drew them, a collective desire to see justice, or at least a good fight. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the charged air. Silas Kincaid sat at a long table at the front, his two men standing behind him like silent sentinels. He wore a smug, confident grin, exchanging glances with a few men known to be in his pocket. He believed his influence was unshakable, that a dusty old deed from a forgotten prospector meant little against his carefully constructed power. Sheriff Brody stood to one side, his face grim, aware of the delicate balance he had to maintain. Elias Thorne entered then, Elara Vance beside him. Lila Vance walked between them, her small hand clutching Elias's, the carved bird held tight in her other. They moved with a quiet dignity, a unified front against the looming storm. Elias felt the weight of every eye, the unspoken hopes and fears of the community settling upon his shoulders. He felt ready. He knew what he carried was more than just a piece of paper. It was a promise, a future, a home. They took their place, standing opposite Kincaid, the air thick with anticipation. The air in the common hall held a different kind of charge now, a quiet expectation that promised more than just words. Elias understood this was not just his fight, but a test of the community's heart. Anyone standing on the edge of a choice sometimes finds their courage in the eyes of others. Sheriff Brody called the meeting to order, his voice strained above the murmuring crowd. Silas Kincaid rose, an arrogant smirk on his face. He began to present his false claim, a rehearsed speech about an old forgotten debt and a verbal agreement, dismissing Elias's long presence in the valley as mere squatting. He spoke with a confident, dismissive tone, as if his words alone would sweep away any opposition. Elias Thorne waited until Kincaid finished, then stepped forward, his movements calm and deliberate. He held up the old deed, its authenticity clear despite its age. His voice was steady as he explained its contents. How Merrick had legally transferred the land rights to a local church charity years ago for the express purpose of building an orphanage. He spoke of Kincaid's deception, of the attempts to defraud not just him, but the very future of the children of the territory. A wave of murmurs rippled through the hall. Sheriff Brody took the deed, examining it closely, his expression serious. He turned it over, checked the signatures, compared it to his own records, his movements slow and methodical. Then he looked up, his gaze sweeping across the room. He confirmed its legitimacy, the land's true ownership to the church, a charity for an orphanage, a clear and undeniable truth. Kincaid's face drained of color, his smug confidence shattering into a look of disbelief and then pure fury. The crowd gasped, a collective shock at the blatant deceit, their eyes now fixed on Kincaid, not Elias. The deed, once a forgotten relic, became a powerful symbol of justice, a beacon of truth in the heart of the common hall. Elias had presented the critical evidence, and now the community faced a choice of where its loyalties lay. After Elias Thorne presented the deed, a heavy, disbelieving silence settled in the common hall. Silas Kincaid stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and rapidly blossoming rage. He stammered, attempting to bluster and dismiss the document as a crude forgery, his voice cracking with fear. Elias remained perfectly calm, holding the deed firm, a quiet, unshakable strength radiating from him. Sheriff Brody, his expression grim, held the paper for all to see, confirming its authenticity with a firm, decisive nod. The very air in the room seemed to shift, a collective realization washing over the gathered townsfolk. Jed, the grizzled bartender, was the first to find his voice. He spoke, his words rough but clear, recounting how Kincaid had tried to strong-arm him out of a prime timber contract just a season past, using similar veiled threats and false claims. Old Man Finch shuffled forward, adding his own tale of Kincaid's deceit, a broken promise about a mining claim that had left Finch nearly destitute. Other townsfolk, emboldened by the undeniable truth and the quiet courage shown by Jed and Finch, began to murmur, then to speak louder, sharing their own accumulated grievances and stories of Kincaid's relentless greed. Kincaid's carefully constructed empire of lies and intimidation visibly crumbled around him. Sheriff Brody, now fully resolute, slammed his hand down on the rough-hewn table. He declared, his voice firm and unwavering, that Silas Kincaid's claim was utterly null and void. The land, he stated unequivocally, belonged rightfully and legally to the church charity for the orphanage, as per Merrick's deed. Brody then ordered Kincaid and his 2 men to immediately vacate the trading post by sunset that very day. He warned them with a steely gaze that any further harassment of Elias, Elara, or any of the townsfolk would result in swift and unhesitating arrest. Kincaid, his face a mottled, furious red, spat a guttural curse, but the unified front of the community, now armed with unassailable truth and newfound courage, left him absolutely no recourse. He stormed out, his 2 thugs following close behind, their earlier swagger entirely gone, leaving a palpable, cleansing sense of relief in the common hall. Elias and Elara exchanged a quiet, profound look, a shared breath of hard-won victory. The immediate, terrifying battle for their home had been decisively won. The next choice, clear and bright, was to decide precisely how to build their future upon this new, solid foundation. A collective sigh of release and a lighter, more hopeful murmur filled the common hall as Silas Kincaid's retreating figures finally disappeared from view. Elias Thorne stepped forward, the deed still held carefully, and began to explain the full, benevolent intent of the late prospector Merrick. He recounted how Merrick had intended the land for a profound charitable purpose, specifically as a place for children without homes, a new orphanage. The very idea sparked a new and vibrant hope in the townsfolk who remained. The harsh reality of frontier life meant that far too many children were left alone, and this prospect offered a tangible, compassionate solution. Sheriff Brody cleared his throat, stating that while the deed specified a church charity, the community itself could certainly rally together to support such a noble endeavor. Jed was quick to offer a generous supply of timber from his own logging operation, a genuine gesture of community goodwill. Old Man Finch, his eyes twinkling, promised his valuable services in finding and transporting skilled carpenters. The murmur of conversation in the hall shifted dramatically, moving from anger and tension to constructive, animated planning for the future. Elias and Elara watched, a profound warmth spreading through them both. Elara, finding her voice strong and clear, spoke, saying that she and Elias would gladly help establish and oversee the orphanage, integrating their home and their lives with this broader, communal purpose. Elias Thorne nodded, his heart swelling with a purpose far greater than his own previous solitary survival. He saw in Elara's unwavering strength a testament to the quiet, powerful essence that had initially drawn him in. The land, once merely a solitary haven, now held the vibrant promise of a shared future for many. Elias felt a profound sense of rightness in the air, a natural unfolding of justice and burgeoning hope. The deed, once a silent weapon, had now transformed into a vibrant blueprint for communal care and the nurturing of new life. Elias and Elara knew that their own journey had just begun, tied now inextricably to the hopeful fate of this growing, compassionate community. Anyone listening in the dark notices a warmer space and keeps it close. Their commitment to this shared vision became their next most meaningful step. Later that afternoon, after the last of the townsfolk had dispersed, Elias Thorne and Elara Vance found a rare, precious moment of quiet outside the common hall. The setting sun cast long, embracing shadows, painting the street in soft orange and deep purple. The air still hummed faintly with the day's momentous events, but a different kind of quiet settled intimately between them, a profound stillness born of shared victory and deep, unspoken understanding. Elias turned fully to Elara, his gaze soft yet intense, and gently took her hands in his. Her fingers, though calloused, felt delicate and strong, a perfect fit in his larger, weathered grasp. He looked deeply into her eyes, seeing not just the fierce, protective mother and the resilient, capable woman, but the very soul that had, against all his expectations, broken through his hardened, solitary shell. He spoke, his voice low and a little rough with emotion, confessing the profound gratitude that now resided deep within him, and a love that had grown silently, steadily, in the protective shelter of their cabin. He told her he had found a true home, not just in the beautiful valley, but unequivocally in her and in Lila, a home more real and comforting than he had ever known. He admitted with a vulnerability that surprised even himself, his old, deep-seated fear of attachment, his crushing self-blame that had driven him to isolation. But he continued, her steadfast presence and Lila's innocent trust had shown him a different, brighter path, a way back to life. He then asked her, not out of any sense of duty or obligation, but from the deepest, most honest part of his rekindled heart, to be his wife, to build a shared future with him. He wanted to share every sunrise, every challenge, every quiet evening by the crackling fire, with her by his side. Tears, bright and shimmering, welled in Elara's eyes. She squeezed his hands in return, her own unspoken emotions a torrent of overwhelming relief, pure joy, and a deep, abiding certainty. She affirmed her profound love for him, for the quiet, strong mountain man who had not only opened his humble cabin, but had, with immense courage, opened his guarded heart to her and to Lila. She told him that he had given them back more than just warmth and shelter. He had given them enduring hope and the promise of a true, loving family. Her voice caught, thick with emotion, as she whispered her heartfelt acceptance, sealing their future. They leaned into each other, a tender, unspoken kiss melting away the last vestiges of their individual sorrows, solidifying their promise to face everything together. Elias felt a profound lightness in his chest, a freeing sense of peace that he had not believed possible for a very, very long time. This is a moment when a careful heart chooses patience over fear. They had found each other, two lost souls once bound by desperate circumstance, now choosing a path of enduring, unconditional love. Their commitment to one another felt as solid as the ancient mountains around them, and their next steps, whatever they might be, would unquestionably be taken together. Several weeks later, as the mountain spring had fully awakened, painting the valley in vibrant greens and sun-drenched yellows, Elias Thorne's cabin, now Elias and Elara's shared home, had undergone a transformation that went far beyond mere repairs. It hummed with new life. Homemade curtains, stitched with care by Elara, billowed gently in the warm breeze, letting in soft, filtered light that chased away the old shadows. Elara Vance's drawings, crude but bursting with the joyful energy of childhood, covered one wall, a vibrant testament to her uninhibited imagination and new happiness. The tools, once scattered, were now neatly organized, reflecting a shared sense of order. Outside, a small, meticulously tended garden thrived where Elias, Elara, and Lila had worked together, hands in the rich, dark earth. Tiny green shoots of corn and beans bravely pushed through the soil, promising future sustenance and symbolizing the growth of their own future. The sturdy rocking chair Elias had built now sat comfortably on the cabin porch, a profound symbol of permanence and quiet domesticity. Lila's happy chatter and infectious giggles filled the air as she chased a brightly colored butterfly through the tall grass, her laughter echoing freely in spaces that had once known only Elias's deep solitude. Elias watched her, a quiet, contented smile on his face, a deep sense of peace and warmth settling irrevocably within him. Elara hummed a soft, familiar tune as she hung laundry, the crisp scent of fresh air mingling beautifully with the rich smell of wood smoke curling from their chimney. The cabin was no longer merely a shelter. It was a living, breathing, vibrant home, filled to its rafters with the tangible warmth of their new, chosen family. Elias often found himself simply sitting, listening intently to the myriad sounds of their shared life, marveling at the quiet, extraordinary miracle that had unfolded around him. He had not believed in such profound peace or enduring happiness for a very long time. Stay a little longer, the stove breath grows steadier, and the truth draws nearer. The very air around the cabin felt undeniably different, charged with a gentle, persistent energy of belonging. Elias knew that his long journey of healing and redemption had finally reached a new, most profound and hopeful chapter. That evening, as the sun dipped majestically below the distant rugged mountains, painting the vast western sky in fiery oranges, soft purples, and deep contemplative blues, Elias Thorne, Elara Vance, and Lila Vance sat together on the cabin porch. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and fresh earth. Lila, drowsy and utterly content in Elara's lap, pointed a small, sleepy finger towards the darkening sky. A flight of geese, their distinctive calls a familiar, comforting sound of the season, winged its way northward, gracefully returning to their summer grounds. Lila asked, her voice soft and heavy with approaching sleepiness, if they were staying forever. Elias looked first at Elara, then down at their precious daughter, then across the familiar, beloved valley that stretched before them. The land, once cold and empty and a symbol of his own isolation, was now blooming vibrantly with life and promise, just like his own heart, which felt full and healed. He and Elara answered together, their voices blending in a gentle, perfect harmony, assuring Lila that they were indeed staying forever, no matter what the future might hold. Elias reached a hand into his pocket, his fingers closing around the small, intricately carved wooden bird. Once it had been a stark, almost unbearable reminder of his profound, crushing loss, a silent, painful ghost of what might have been. Now its smooth, warm wood felt wonderfully comforting against his skin, its meaning irrevocably transformed. It was no longer a poignant symbol of crushing grief, but a powerful emblem of enduring hope, of lasting love, of the courage to embrace a precious second chance, and of the profound, soul-deep healing that had finally taken root within him. He understood now, with a clarity that resonated through his very being, that he had not just found a place to live, a mere shelter. He had found his true, permanent home and a loving family that had miraculously mended his deepest, most painful wound. The last lingering rays of sunlight gilded the highest peaks of the mountains, painting them in shimmering gold. Smoke rose in a steady, comforting plume from their chimney, a clear, unmistakable signal of life continuing, of hearth and home, of presence and belonging. Elias Thorne, the solitary mountain man who had once sought to outrun his sorrow, was solitary no longer. He had a name given by love. He had land secured by justice. And most importantly, he had each other, a bond stronger than any mountain storm. He looked at Elara, his partner and his love, then down at their daughter, then at the home they had built from nothing but determination and unwavering love. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones and warmed his spirit that they had made it. They really did, he thought, a profound sense of gratitude washing over him. Elias smiled, a true, open, joyful smile, the kind that reached his eyes. Tonight the house remembered how to breathe, a quiet, joyful sigh after holding its breath for so long. A soft breeze carrying the promise of summer rustled the tender leaves of the newly planted sapling outside, a gentle whisper of spring that promised many more seasons of shared life, love, and growth in the valley.